Confident that the cleaning lady was ignorant, the Millionaire CEO and his partners switched languages to discuss their secret plans in front of her. "Don't worry, she doesn't understand anything," he mocked. They laughed and spoke openly until the oldest partner stood up and stopped the conversation. Looking at the CEO, he revealed, "Actually, she owns all of this and came disguised today just to see who you really were." The silence that followed was deadly. The scent of artisanal coffee and thinly veiled ambition hung heavy in the glass and steel corridors of Olympus Ventures, an aroma Lynn knew well, though it now felt foreign, almost desecrated. Her fingers, once accustomed to the delicate feel of porcelain and the smooth drape of silk, now gripped the handle of a janitor's cart. The simple, functional navy blue uniform was a perfect disguise, a cloak of invisibility that both shielded her and filled her with sorrow. Every step she took on the cold, polished marble was a silent echo of a promise made beside a hospital bed, a vow whispered to the man who had been her world, Kenji. His name was a hot coal in her chest, a constant reminder of the legacy that now rested heavily on her shoulders. The firm they had built together, brick by brick, founded on trust and honor, felt like it had lost its soul. She sensed it in the way the younger employees averted their gaze, in the metallic tone of hurried conversations, and the tension hiding beneath forced smiles. Across the glassed-in hallway, she watched Marcus Thorne, the head of domestic strategy, rehearsing his presentation in front of a mirror. He adjusted his Italian silk tie, the arrogant gesture of a man who feels untouchable. Marcus was the embodiment of everything Kenji had loathed, a man who saw people as numbers and values as mere obstacles to profit. He managed the company's assets as if they were his personal safe, and whispers about his lack of scruples had reached Yumi's ears, even in her reclusive mourning. It was these whispers that had drawn her out of the house, that had made her trade her designer dresses for a cleaning uniform. She needed to see with her own eyes, to feel the truth behind the spreadsheets and optimistic reports. She needed to know who was staining the name that she and Kenji had spent a lifetime building. A discreet, almost imperceptible nod came from a corner of the hallway. It was Mr. Kaito Watanabe, the most senior executive of the Japanese conglomerate and a loyal family friend. His eyes, behind thin lenses, transmitted a clear message. It's time. He was her only ally here, the guardian of her secret. Lynn nodded subtly, pushing the cart toward the grand boardroom. The solid mahogany door felt like a fortress, guarding the secrets and decisions that would shape the future of thousands of employees. The muffled sound of Marcus's voice could already be heard, confident and presumptuous. Lynn took a deep breath, her heart beating a steady rhythm of fear and determination. She was no longer Yumi Tanaka, the grieving widow. Here, in this hallway, she was Lynn, the cleaner, a shadow about to step onto center stage. With firm hands, she turned the handle, pushing the door open slowly, the soft sound of the wood marking the beginning of her silent assessment. The stage was set, and she was ready to discover the truth, no matter how painful. The silence in the boardroom was heavy, thick like the mahogany of the table that stretched out as a monument to power. All eyes, previously fixed on charts and projections, turned toward her. Lynn felt the weight of those dozens of eyes, a mixture of annoyance and indifference. To them, she was an interruption, a jarring note in the symphony of big business. She kept her head slightly lowered, not out of submission, but to conceal the flame of indignation threatening to show in her gaze. She began her task with deliberate slowness, moving along the periphery of the room. First, the coffee station. Her movements were precise, mechanical, a silent ballet she had practiced mentally. Serving the coffee was the perfect excuse to get closer, to listen, to observe. As she filled the fine porcelain cups, her mind registered every detail, the way one of the partners, a younger man with gold-rimmed glasses, drummed his fingers on the table. How another glanced at the expensive watch on his wrist, the impassive expression of Mr. Watanabe, her sole confidant in this viper's nest. One of the junior partners, visibly uncomfortable with the pause, cleared his throat. Marcus, sensing the awkwardness, let out an arrogant laugh, a sound that grated on Lynn's ears. "Don't worry, she doesn't understand a thing," he sneered, a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. The phrase hit her like a slap. Not Lynn, the cleaner, but Yumi, the woman who had debated investment strategies and market futures in this very room with her husband. The woman who perfectly understood the meaning of rising and falling stocks and the importance of protecting the assets they had built. She continued her work, her face a mask of neutrality, while internally a storm was brewing. Every cup she placed on the table was a small act of defiance. They saw only a servant, ignorant of the power she truly held. To emphasize his point and reaffirm his dominance, Marcus switched languages, his voice gliding into fluent, impeccable Japanese. He turned to Mr. Watanabe, a gesture intended as respect, but overflowing with conceit. "As I was saying, Mr. Watanabe," he began in the language he believed was his secret fortress, "we have a unique opportunity to consolidate our capital." A chill ran down Lynn's spine. It was worse than she imagined. His arrogance was so profound that he not only planned to deceive his peers, but did so openly, using the language of their ancestors as a shield for his dishonor. She paused briefly beside a window, pretending to wipe an invisible smudge from the glass, the reflection showing the scene like a macabre theater. The CEO, confident in his linguistic armor, and the partners, some confused, others complicit, watching. What he said next, believing himself protected by the language barrier, would reveal the true depth of his betrayal. Marcus's voice, now in the language Lynn knew as intimately as her own, began to distill its venom. "As I was saying, Mr. Watanabe," he repeated, the tone falsely reverent, "we're going to cook the third quarter books. We'll pin the deficit on the previous management, lay off 30% of the grassroots team, and use the money saved to pay out our bonuses." Lynn's blood ran cold. Every word was a nail in the coffin of the honor her husband had cherished. Cook the books. Blame the previous management, blame Kenji. The audacity of the plan was as shocking as its cruelty. Kenji considered every employee an extension of his family. He knew their names, their stories. Now, Marcus spoke of discarding them like faulty pieces on an assembly line, all to inflate his own wealth and that of his accomplices. Lynn tightened her grip on the cleaning rag, the rough texture anchoring her to reality. Preventing the scream trapped in her throat from escaping, she dared to raise her gaze, just for a second, and her eyes met Mr. Watanabe's. There wasn't a shred of surprise on his face, only a deep, contained disappointment, a sadness that seemed to age him further. He knew. He had been waiting for this. That silent look of complicity gave Lynn the strength she needed to continue her charade. She turned and began collecting the empty cups, her movements even slower, each second an eternity in which she was forced to listen to the desecration of her family's legacy. Then, the cruelest blow. Marcus, in his arrogance, gestured toward her with a nod of contempt. "She," he said in Japanese, his voice laced with disdain, "will be the first to go. She's just part of the scenery. She won't understand a word of what we're planning." Lynn's world stopped for an instant. The distant hum of the air conditioning, the scrape of a chair. Everything faded, part of the scenery, a thing, invisible, insignificant. The humiliation burned within her, but quickly transformed into something colder, harder, a steel determination. He wasn't just underestimating her, he was erasing her. In that moment, Marcus didn't just seal the fate of 30% of the team, he sealed his own. He continued speaking for several minutes, detailing how the funds would be diverted, how the company's assets would be reconfigured to maximize immediate profit without any concern for sustainability or employee well-being. He spoke of dividends and bonuses as if they were divine rights, earned by his supposed genius. When he finally concluded his arrogant speech, a satisfied smirk spread across his face. He leaned back in his chair, expecting applause, the nods of approval from his peers. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and laden with expectation. He looked directly at Mr. Watanabe, the conglomerate's representative, the man whose blessing was the final key to his immoral plan. The entire room held its breath, waiting. The silence that settled in the room after Marcus's speech was different from before. It was no longer a silence of attention, but a heavy, uncomfortable void. Seconds stretched out, pulling Marcus's confidence to the breaking point. His smug smile faltered, transforming into a mask of uncertainty. He looked from one partner to another, seeking the nod of agreement that didn't come. The man with the gold-rimmed glasses stopped drumming his fingers and hid them under the table. Another swallowed hard, the sound too loud in the oppressive stillness. A thin sheen of sweat began to shine on Marcus's forehead. What was happening? His plan was brilliant, a masterstroke to maximize profit and secure a personal fortune. He had delivered the heads of the low-level employees on a silver platter, exactly the kind of ruthless pragmatism the business world often celebrates. Why, then, this hesitation? His gaze fixed on Mr. Watanabe, the final piece of the puzzle, the man whose approval was the only one that truly mattered. But the senior executive remained motionless, his face a blank slate, his eyes dark and indecipherable. Lynn continued her work, an island of calm movement in a sea of paralyzed tension. She picked up the trash bin, her final pretext for remaining in the room. Each second of silence was a small victory, another nail in the coffin of Marcus's arrogance. She felt the energy of the room shift, certainty turning into doubt, admiration into suspicion. Beneath the uniform, her heart pounded, a war drum announcing the battle to come. She thought of Kenji, of how much he would hate this room right now. He believed that a company's true capital lay not in its assets or stock listings, but in the loyalty and well-being of its people. Marcus and his accomplices had twisted Kenji's dream into a nightmare of greed, and she was here to wake them up. Then a sound broke the spell, the soft squeak of a chair being pushed back. Slowly, deliberately, Mr. Watanabe rose. He was not a tall man, and the years had curved his shoulders, but in that moment, he seemed to fill the entire room. All attention, previously scattered, converged on him. Marcus straightened in his seat, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Approval was coming, finally. But Mr. Watanabe did not look at Marcus. He didn't even acknowledge the trembling CEO's existence. His gaze passed over everyone, over the mahogany table and the financial projections, and landed, with surprising intensity, on Lynn. He looked at her, the cleaner, the scenery, the invisible woman. Shock coursed through the room like an electric current. Eyebrows arched, mouths fell open in silent confusion. Marcus froze, the blood beginning to drain from his face. What the hell did this mean? That look wasn't from a superior to a subordinate. There was something more there, something he couldn't decipher, and the unknown terrified him. The tension in the room twisted into a blind knot of confusion. Marcus looked from Mr. Watanabe to Lynn, and back to Mr. Watanabe, his mind racing to process the surreal scene. Why was the distinguished representative of the Japanese conglomerate, a man whose time was worth millions of dollars a minute, looking at the cleaner with such intensity? Was it a test, some kind of business metaphor he couldn't grasp in his anxiety? Marcus's mind, usually so agile for plots and strategies, was short-circuiting. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to break the awkward silence with a joke, but no sound came out. The voice that finally broke the silence wasn't his. It was Mr. Watanabe's, and his words, delivered in clear, flawless English, hit like sledgehammers on glass. "Your Japanese is excellent, Marcus." The phrase itself was a compliment, but the tone was glacial. There was no warmth, no approval. It was the statement of a fact, spoken with the detachment of a judge about to deliver a sentence. Marcus felt momentary relief. Maybe everything was fine. Maybe he was just paranoid. He forced a smile, a nervous spasm on his pale face. "Thank you, Mr. Watanabe. I strove to..." But he was interrupted. Mr. Watanabe raised a hand, a subtle gesture that instantly silenced Marcus, and then came the second hammer blow, the one that shattered Marcus's world into 1,000 pieces. But hers is native. The silence that followed was even deeper, heavier. It was the silence of absolute shock, of incredulity. The partners looked at each other, eyes wide. The cleaner, native Japanese. What did that have to do with the business presentation? The gears in Marcus's mind stopped completely. The blood that had begun to leave his face now abandoned him in a cold wave, leaving him waxen pale. The sweat on his forehead turned into cold drops running down his temples. But hers is native. The words echoed in his head, devoid of meaning, yet carrying a terrible, imminent threat. Completely ignoring the paralyzed CEO, Mr. Watanabe circled the table. His steps were slow, reverent. Each step was a silent condemnation. He didn't stop until he was directly in front of Lynn, who had stopped working and now watched him, her face still impassive, but her eyes. There was something in her eyes, a long, dormant authority, a force beginning to emerge from the shadows. And then, before the entire board of Olympus Ventures, Mr. Watanabe, one of the most powerful men in the conglomerate, a billionaire whose mere name opened doors globally, did the unthinkable. He bowed. Not a simple nod, but a deep, respectful ojigi, the kind of profound reverence reserved for the highest honor. The partners' jaws dropped. Marcus felt his legs weaken. The world no longer made sense. And then Mr. Watanabe spoke again, his voice still low, but now directed to her. "Mrs. Yumi, is your assessment complete?" The question hung in the air, weighted with a meaning that none there, save two, could grasp. The name Yumi lingered in the room like an apparition. It wasn't just any name. It was a legend in the company's halls, the name of the founder's wife, Kenji Tanaka, an almost mythical figure who, after her husband's death, had completely withdrawn from public life, entrusting the management of her vast inheritance to councils and executives. It was a name associated with an incalculable fortune, assets spanning continents, with investments in stocks, gold, and the latest cryptocurrencies. The idea that this woman, Mrs. Yumi Tanaka, could be the cleaner picking up trash was so absurd, so fantastically impossible, that the minds of those present refused to process it. They looked from the bowing figure of the respectable Mr. Watanabe to the woman in the navy blue uniform, and their brains simply couldn't connect the dots. Was it a joke? An elaborate prank? But Marcus's pale, terrified face told a different story. He was beginning to understand, and the comprehension was an abyss opening beneath his feet. Lynn, or rather Yumi, finally let the mask drop. The slightly stooped posture of the cleaner vanished, replaced by an imposing straightness. The lowered, submissive gaze gave way to a cold, cutting expression of unquestionable authority. It was as if a queen had been revealed beneath a servant's rags. She looked at Mr. Watanabe, his reverence still maintained, and responded in perfect Japanese, the language flowing from her with the naturalness of a stream. Her words were few, but loaded with finality. Then she turned. Her gaze now met Marcus's, and what he saw there made him tremble. It wasn't rage, it wasn't hatred. It was something far worse, icy disappointment, the kind of look a god might give a failed creation before discarding it. And then she spoke to him in English. The voice was not that of Lin, the quiet cleaner. It was the voice of Yumi Tanaka, a voice accustomed to being heard in boardrooms, a voice that carried the weight of an empire. I co-founded this company with my late husband on the bedrock of honor, Mr. Thorne, not fraud. Every word was precise, sharp. The word honor left her lips like a sentence. She didn't shout, she didn't accuse, she merely stated a fact, a truth as fundamental as the floor beneath their feet, the truth upon which Olympus Ventures was built, and the truth Marcus had tried to bury beneath a mountain of lies and greed. The contrast between her speech and his was stark. He, with his long speeches about profits and bonuses. She, with her single sentence, demolishing his entire house of cards. The other partners recoiled in their chairs, trying to distance themselves from Marcus, as if his disgrace were a contagious disease. The man with the gold-rimmed glasses looked like he might vomit. Their fate was sealed, and the executioner was the woman whom, minutes before, they had dismissed as part of the scenery. Mr. Watanabe finally straightened, his face a mask of professional seriousness, as if the extraordinary scene he had just participated in were standard procedure. He addressed the pale, trembling CEO, his voice calm but with an undertone of steel that left no room for doubt. Marcus, she is not the cleaner. She is Yumi Tanaka. He paused, allowing the name and its full implication to settle in everyone's stunned minds. Then he delivered the phrase that recontextualized everything, that transformed the business meeting into a courtroom. She owns all of this, and she came in disguise to see who you truly were. The revelation fell upon the room like a neutron bomb, annihilating all structures of power and hierarchy, leaving only raw shock behind. The owner, not a majority shareholder, not a distant heir, but the proprietor, the source of all the wealth, all the capital they had so arrogantly manipulated. Marcus stumbled backward, his hand seeking the support of the chair as if his legs could no longer hold him. The sweat now drenched his expensive shirt. He looked at Yumi, and for the first time, he saw her. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her posture, the power radiating from her. The cleaner had vanished, and in her place was the personification of his failure. Yumi, in a gesture loaded with symbolism, took the cleaning rag she was still holding and tossed it into the trash bin she was carrying. It was the end of Lin, the end of the disguise, the end of the charade. She was now fully present as Yumi Tanaka, the company matriarch. Mr. Watanabe, she said, her voice firm and in command, please call security. Mr. Thorne and everyone who agreed with him are terminated. The order was clear. The execution immediate. There would be no investigation, no HR review, no severance packages. Justice here was as swift and decisive as an emperor's. Some of the junior partners began to stammer, to protest, to try to explain themselves. I didn't agree, said one. It was all his idea, accused another. But Yumi paid them no mind. Her gaze was fixed on Marcus, who now stared at her with a mixture of panic and something more, a flicker of defiance. In one final, desperate act, he tried to appeal to the twisted logic that governed his world. You can't do this, he hissed, his voice a ragged whisper. This will crash the stock value. It will cause market panic. The company's net worth will plummet. But before he could continue, a calm and unexpected voice interrupted his frenzied speech. On the contrary, everyone turned. A young man, seated discreetly in a corner of the room throughout the meeting, an assistant no one had noticed, stood up. He removed his glasses, revealing surprisingly familiar eyes. Yumi turned to him, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips for the first time. The young man stepped forward. "My name is Ken Tanaka Jr.," he said, his voice ringing with the same calm authority as his mother's, "and we anticipated all of this." The appearance of Ken Tanaka Jr. was the secondary shockwave, as devastating as the first. If Yumi's revelation was the downfall of a king, her son's presence was the ascent of a new dynasty, right there, before the terrified eyes of the conspirators. Ken Jr., or Ken as he preferred to be called, did not have his father's imposing physique, but he possessed a composure and confidence that seemed even more formidable. He moved with an economy of gesture, his clear eyes analyzing the room with a cold intelligence reminiscent of his mother's. The terminated partners, who moments before were desperately trying to absolve themselves, now shrank into their chairs, the last drop of hope draining from their faces. They were not just facing the company owner, they were facing its future, a future to which they clearly had not been invited. Marcus, however, seemed galvanized by this new threat. Desperate denial gave way to impotent rage. "You!" he spat in Ken's direction, the contempt evident in his voice. You're a nobody. A kid who spent his life burning Dad's fortune on globe-trotting and expensive toys." He was clinging to rumors, to social column gossip from years ago, the last ammunition he had left. Ken was unperturbed. He walked slowly to the head of the table, where a laptop was connected to the projector. With a few clicks, the screen that previously displayed Marcus's fraudulent charts now showed a series of complex data streams, cryptocurrency graphs, and real-time stock market movements. "While you were busy planning how to divert company money to pay your bonuses," Ken said, his voice calm and cutting, "I was using my toy money to create a security net for the family's assets." He pointed to one of the graphs. "Over the last 6 months, anticipating the instability your poor management would cause, we quietly diversified a significant portion of our holdings. We moved capital into safer funds, invested heavily in gold and even Bitcoin, anticipating a dip in the traditional market when news of your fraud broke." He looked directly at Marcus, a gleam of steel in his eyes. "The drop in stock value won't be a crisis, it will be a correction, and we are already positioned to buy back those shares at a lower price, consolidating our control and cleaning the company of people like you." The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. They weren't just firing Marcus, they were using his own greed as a weapon to strengthen the company. Yumi watched her son, a fierce pride shining in her eyes. This was Kenji's true legacy, not just the wealth, but the intelligence, the foresight, and above all, the honor he had instilled in his heir. The security guards arrived, 2 imposing figures at the door. The charade was over. The day of reckoning had arrived. The arrival of the security team was the silent, brutal period mark on the careers of Marcus and his accomplices. There were no shouts, no resistance. The revelation of Ken Jr.'s plan had broken the last vestiges of fight they had left. They were defeated not just by authority, but by superior intelligence, a far deeper humiliation for men who prided themselves on their cunning. One by one, they stood up, faces a mixture of shame and resignation, and were escorted out of the room like schoolboys caught cheating on a test. The silence they left behind was clean, like the air after a thunderstorm. Yumi watched the door close behind the last of them, the man with the gold-rimmed glasses, and let out a slow, deep sigh, the weight of months of planning and anguish finally beginning to dissipate. She looked at her son, who was calmly disconnecting his laptop, and at Mr. Watanabe, who remained by her side like a rock. "Good, it's over," she whispered, more to herself than to them. "The first part is," Ken corrected gently, He approached her, his gaze serious. Now comes the real work, rebuilding trust, repairing the damage. He was right. The purge was necessary, but the wound left by Marcus's management was deep. The company culture had been poisoned by greed and fear. Yumi walked over to the grand panoramic window, looking out over the expanse of the Manhattan skyline that stretched below, buildings scraping the sky, rivers of cars flowing along the avenues. Each one of those points of light was a home, a family, and many of them depended on Olympus Ventures for their livelihood. Marcus's decision to lay off 30% of the grassroots team wasn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It was a sentence of despair for hundreds of people. "What will we do about the employees?" she asked, her voice laden with concern. "The ones he planned to fire, the ones who worked under the fear he created." Mr. Watanabe stepped forward, his usually impassive face now showing genuine warmth. "We are already handling that, Mrs. Yumi. Ken and I prepared a transition plan. No one will be laid off. On the contrary, we will announce a complete salary and benefits audit, plus a new profit-sharing program. We want everyone to know that the era of exploitation is over, and that they are, as Mr. Kenji always said, the greatest asset of this company." His words were a balm to Yumi's wounded soul. It was the right thing to do, the only way forward. It was what her husband would have done, but while one part of the crisis seemed resolved, a new concern began to form in her mind. She remembered a detail in Marcus's speech, a detail that was overshadowed at the time by his greater betrayal. He had mentioned blaming the previous management. Why would he feel so confident in staining Kenji's name? Was it just a weak excuse, or was there something more? Something Marcus knew, or thought he knew, that he could use to justify his actions and denigrate her husband's legacy? Yumi's sense of relief began to be corroded by a new, unsettling wave of uncertainty. The question hung in the air, a dissonant note in the atmosphere of victory. Why did Marcus feel so secure in blaming Kenji's management? Yumi looked at Mr. Watanabe, whose eyes narrowed slightly, and at Ken, who frowned in concentration. The implication was sinister. It wasn't just a matter of shifting blame, it was a calculated strategy, and that suggested Marcus believed he had some proof, real or fabricated, to support his claim. He wouldn't have said that without something to stand on, Ken said, verbalizing everyone's thought. Even in his arrogance, he wouldn't be foolish enough to make an empty accusation against the company founder in front of the entire board. Fear, a feeling Yumi thought she had left behind upon entering that room, began to insinuate itself back into her heart. Kenji's legacy, his honor, was the most precious thing she had left. The idea that someone could tarnish it was unbearable. "We need to find out what he was planning," Yumi said, her voice firm again, uncertainty giving way to resolve. "Watanabe-san, please instruct the IT team to secure Marcus's computer and all his files. I want a complete forensic analysis, every email, every document, every transaction." Mr. Watanabe nodded solemnly. "It is already being done, Mrs. Yumi." The order was given the moment security was called. The efficiency and loyalty of her old friend were a comfort amidst the new storm that was brewing. Ken, for his part, was already back at his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "I'm remotely accessing the servers," he explained, "searching for any file or communication that mentions my father's name or previous management. If Marcus was plotting something, he probably left a digital trail." As Ken worked, Yumi revisited the last few years in her mind. After Kenji's death, she had stepped back, trusting the management of the empire to people like Marcus, who came highly recommended. Had that been a mistake? Had her grief blinded her to the dangers infiltrating the company she and her husband built? A flashback hit her with the force of a punch. A conversation, a few months after Kenji's funeral. She was in the library of her home, surrounded by books he loved, when Marcus visited. He spoke about the need to streamline operations, to cut fat, and make tough decisions that Kenji, in his generosity, might have avoided. At the time, she interpreted it as the ambition of a young executive. Now, his words took on a sinister tone. He was planting the seeds of his narrative from the beginning, setting the stage to blame Kenji's humane business philosophy for any deficit he himself created. The memory left a bitter taste in her mouth. Marcus's betrayal was not an impulsive act of greed. It was a long, calculated campaign to erase Kenji's legacy and replace it with his own, and she suspected she hadn't yet discovered the full extent of his perfidy. Hours passed. The daylight that flooded the boardroom gave way to the glittering lights of the city at night. The adrenaline of the confrontation had subsided, replaced by tense exhaustion and a somber determination. Water bottles and half-empty coffee cups now dotted the large mahogany table, silent witnesses to the new crisis. Ken remained absorbed in his digital hunt, the screen of his laptop reflecting in his glasses as he dove deep into the dark corners of the Olympus Ventures servers. Yumi and Mr. Watanabe sat in silence, the presence of the other a mute comfort. Each was lost in their own thoughts, revisiting the past for clues they might have missed. Yumi remembered Kenji's passion for innovative investments, his almost childlike enthusiasm for the rise of cryptocurrencies, not just as a source of wealth, but as a tool to democratize finance. He would have been fascinated by Ken's strategy, but also deeply saddened that it had been necessary. Suddenly, Ken let out a low sound, a murmur of surprise. "I found something," he said, without taking his eyes off the screen. "It's not an email or a document. It's a folder buried deep in an archival server with multiple layers of encryption. The folder name is Contingency Plan." The name was vague, but sounded ominous. "Can you open it?" Yumi asked, her heart racing. "I'm trying," Ken replied. "The encryption is military grade. Marcus really didn't want anyone to find this, but he made a mistake. He used a password based on something personal." Ken's fingers danced over the keyboard. Men like Marcus always think they're the smartest person in the room. They become predictable in their arrogance. Birth dates, pet names, expensive car models. He stopped typing, or in this case, the ticker code of one of his favorite stocks. A click on the screen, a green progress bar slowly filled, then disappeared. The folder was open. What they found was more insidious than they could have imagined. It wasn't a plan to steal money or manipulate numbers. It was a plan to steal a history, to rewrite the past. The folder contained a series of meticulously forged documents, fake emails, altered transaction records, and even a manufactured journal, supposedly written by a former, now deceased CFO. Together, they painted a devastating picture. They insinuated that Kenji, in the last years of his life, while battling illness, had become reckless, making high-risk investments and nearly bankrupting the company. Marcus's narrative would be that he, the savior, had arrived just in time to reverse the disaster, and that the layoffs and cuts were the painful but necessary consequences of Kenji's poor management. It was a lie so complete, so diabolically well constructed, that it might have been believed. Yumi felt the air leave her lungs. Marcus didn't just want to blame Kenji. He wanted to destroy his memory, erase the image of the visionary, honorable leader, and replace it with that of a senile fool. It was the final, cruelest act of a soulless man. The silence that settled in the boardroom was heavier and more suffocating than any previous tension. It was the silence of a desecrated sanctuary. Yumi looked at the laptop screen, where the cold, calculated words of Marcus's lie shone with a poisonous light. Each forged document was a stab, but the fake journal was the twisting of the blade in her heart. She read excerpts that described a Kenji she never knew, a scared, confused man, lamenting failed investments and the loss of his Midas touch for business. One passage in particular made her recoil as if physically struck. In it, the fake Kenji confessed to having gambled a significant portion of the company's assets on a risky European fund application that resulted in a loss, a secret he would take to the grave. Yumi remembered that period. Kenji was weak, yes, but his mind was sharper than ever. They spent hours discussing the future, not with fear, but with serene planning, ensuring their legacy would be safe. That journal was not just a lie. It was a profanation of their most intimate memories. The strength that had sustained her all day evaporated, and a wave of cold nausea rose up her spine. What if people believed it? She stood up, walking on trembling legs to the window, hugging herself to contain the tremor. The vast fortune they built seemed insignificant now. What was at stake was Kenji's soul, his honor, and she felt, for one terrifying moment, that she might lose it. "Mom." Ken's voice was low, but charged with an intensity that made her turn. He wasn't looking at her with pity, but with the feverish concentration of a codebreaker about to crack the cipher. "It's too perfect," he said, more to himself. "The narrative is impeccable. Every piece fits, but real life isn't like that. Real life is messy." Marcus focused so much on writing the perfect story that he forgot that every digital story leaves a ghost. Ken's eyes gleamed with a new light, the excitement of a hunter finding his prey's track. He pointed to a series of almost incomprehensible code lines next to one of the documents. "It's the metadata, the digital soul of a file. They tell the true story of its birth." Marcus was smart enough to forge the visible dates on the documents, but not smart enough to rewrite the server's immutable records. It's like writing a letter, dating it 1955, but sending it with today's FedEx tracking number. Ken typed a series of commands, and the screen transformed, revealing a list. All these files, the journal, the transaction records, the emails, all of them have a creation or last modified timestamp from the last 3 weeks, and all of them originated from a single network terminal, a single IP address. He paused dramatically before clicking one last time, revealing the owner of that address. The computer in the CEO's office, Marcus's computer. The proof was there, irrefutable and digitally signed. Mr. Watanabe, watching over Ken's shoulder, suddenly reached out and pointed to the screen. "Wait, that record," he said, his voice thickening with emotion. "The European funds transaction. The date." His eyes glazed over for a moment. Traveling away from that room. I remember that day perfectly. It was impossible for Mr. Kenji to have signed or authorized anything. It was the day my first granddaughter was born. Kenji cancelled all his meetings and spent the entire day with me at the hospital. He held my granddaughter and said that was the only kind of asset that truly mattered. The alibi, the human proof, joined the digital proof, forging an unbreakable truth. In that instant, something changed inside Yumi. The ice of despair was evaporated by a white-hot fury. Pain transformed into power. Violation became her armor. They hadn't just profaned Kenji's grave. They had merely handed her the shovel to dig theirs. She walked back to the table, each step firm and deliberate. The trembling woman at the window had disappeared, replaced by the queen returning to reclaim her kingdom. Her gaze met her son's and her most loyal friends. An alliance forged in honor and steel. "They won't just fail to destroy his legacy," she said, her voice calm but resonating with an authority that could shake the building's foundations. "We will use this lie to immortalize him." The moment of greatest tension had turned into a decisive turning point. "Mr. Watanabe, call an emergency meeting with all employees for tomorrow morning. And Ken, my son, prepare the best presentation of your life. I want every single one of those lies projected onto the largest screen we have, right next to the truth they tried to bury." The grand auditorium of Olympus Ventures, A space usually reserved for quarterly earnings announcements and optimistic corporate presentations was charged with a different kind of electricity. The buzz of hundreds of anxious conversations created a cacophony of fear. The emergency summons, sent in the middle of the night, gave no details, allowing imaginations to run wild in the darkest direction. Rumors about the instability of the company's stock and the need for drastic cuts, the very ones Marcus had cynically planned, were the main theory. Men and women who had dedicated years of their lives to the firm looked at each other, their faces marked by uncertainty, silently wondering if they would have a job by the end of the morning. When the stage lights came up and Yumi, Ken, and Mr. Watanabe emerged from the wings, an abrupt, heavy silence fell over the crowd. For the overwhelming majority, Yumi was just a name on a bronze plaque in the lobby, the founder's widow, a distant, reclusive figure. Seeing her there in person with a posture of quiet authority was the first indication that this was no ordinary day. With a calmness that seemed to radiate from the stage, Yumi approached the podium. She adjusted the microphone, and the small noise seemed to echo through the absolute silence. Her eyes swept the audience, seeing not an anonymous mass of employees, but hundreds of individuals, each with a story, a family, hopes, and fears. In that moment, they were not her employees. They were her responsibility. She did not begin with corporate jargon or the shocking news of the betrayal. She started with a story, her voice clear and steady, and transported everyone more than 30 years into the past, to a small rented room with second-hand furniture. "Kenji and I had a dream," she began, "but almost no money. We had an idea, a business plan scribbled on a napkin, and an unwavering faith in each other." She spoke of the difficult decision to sell a solid gold watch, a family heirloom her husband cherished, to raise the initial capital. That watch was a valuable asset. But Kenji told me something I never forgot. Honor and people are the only assets that time cannot devalue. As she spoke, the giant screen behind her came to life, not with profitability charts, but with black and white photographs. Kenji and a much younger Yumi smiling beside their first typewriter, the small initial team celebrating with cake at a metal desk, the opening of their first real office. The atmosphere of fear in the auditorium began to melt, replaced by a wave of nostalgia and respect. Many of the oldest employees were visibly moved, remembering the man who always knew their names. It was then that Ken took the stage. The transition was smooth, but the change in tone was immediate. With the precision of a surgeon, he began to expose Marcus's fraud. He projected the forged emails, the altered transaction records. Beside each lie, he displayed the irrefutable proof of the truth, the timestamp metadata, Mr. Watanabe's testimony about his alibi with Kenji, the glaring inconsistencies that Marcus's arrogance prevented him from seeing. Gasps of surprise and then anger rippled through the audience. The attempt to assassinate the reputation of a good man was exposed in all its ugliness. Yumi took the floor again. "For these acts of dishonor," she declared, her voice resonating with unquestionable finality, "Mr. Thorne and his collaborators have been summarily terminated." Spontaneous, thunderous applause erupted, a cathartic release of months of tension. But she raised her hand, asking for silence. "However, we are not here today to talk about endings. We are here to talk about new beginnings." It was then that she announced the salary audit, the profit-sharing program, and the masterstroke, the creation of the Kenji Tanaka Foundation. "The money that would have been destined for the bonuses of those who betrayed us," she said, her voice catching with emotion for the first time, "will now be the initial investment for this foundation, a permanent fund for the education of your children and for supporting our community." The ovation that followed was deafening, a tsunami of relief, gratitude, and joy. Yumi looked at those smiling, tear-filled faces and knew, with absolute certainty, that her husband's legacy was not only safe, it was more alive than ever. In the weeks and months that followed that memorable meeting, Olympus Ventures underwent a transformation that went far beyond its corporate structure. It was a change of soul. The corridors, once silent and tense, now echoed with the sound of animated conversations and laughter. Office doors, which used to remain closed, were now open, a symbol of the new era of transparency and collaboration. Yumi, shedding forever the image of the reclusive widow, became the company's beating heart. She instituted a weekly lunch with the CEO in the main cafeteria, where any employee could sit with her and Ken to share ideas or concerns, transforming the rigid hierarchy into a connected community. She walked the facilities, not as an inspector, but as a proud matriarch, learning about projects, praising work well done, and most importantly, listening. She rediscovered the joy of leading, not for power, but for the purpose of nurturing and protecting the large family she and Kenji had created. Ken flourished in his role as CEO, proving that honor and business success were not mutually exclusive. With Mr. Watanabe's wise guidance, he initiated a series of investments focused on sustainability and long-term innovation. The focus shifted from the artificial inflation of quarterly profit to building a robust cash flow and a solid asset base for the coming decades. He proved it was possible to offer fair wages, excellent benefits, and healthy dividends to shareholders. Provided greed was removed from the equation, the market response was a testament to their approach. Analysts who predicted chaos after the mass termination of the executive team now praise the stability and ethical vision of Olympus Ventures, which became a model for corporate governance. Restored confidence meant that their stock value not only recovered but reached new heights. On a sunny autumn afternoon, Yumi was in what had been her husband's office, now hers. The walls no longer featured expensive, abstract modern art, but photos of the company teams and drawings made by employees, children, sent to her after the foundation's creation. From her window, she watched the small park across the street. She saw Mrs. Klein from accounting pushing her granddaughter on a swing. She saw a group of young R&D engineers playing catch during lunch break. A serene, profound smile lit up her face. She finally understood fully. Kenji's true legacy was never in his net worth records, his fortune in dollars and euros, or the value of his investments. The greatest treasure they built was invisible in the financial spreadsheets. It was the smiles in that park. It was the thank you letters she received from students whose tuition fees the foundation was paying. It was the security and dignity of the thousands of families whose prosperity was intertwined with the company's. Ken entered the room silently, bringing 2 cups of tea. He stopped beside her, following her gaze. The first scholar of the Kenji Tanaka Foundation was accepted into medical school, he said softly. It's the shift manager's daughter from the factory floor. He said he worked his whole life dreaming of this day. Yumi felt her eyes well up, this time with pure joy. She took her son's hand, their fingers intertwining. Your father would be so proud of you, Ken. He squeezed her hand affectionately. He'd be proud of us, he corrected. And you showed us the way, Mom. Together, they looked out the window, not as owners of an empire, but as guardians of a dream. The journey had been forged in pain, but it led them to redemption. They had proven that honor was not a relic of the past, but the safest foundation for the future. True wealth, they now knew, was not accumulated in vaults, but multiplied with every life touched by kindness.